Your Excellency, Mr. Keller unexpectedly and rapturously jumped over to the general. If there's need of a satisfactory person for the night, I'm prepared to make the sacrifice for a friend, he's such a soul. I've long considered him a great man, Your Excellency. I, of course, have neglected my education, but when he criticizes, it's pearls pouring out, Your Excellency. The general turned away in despair. I'll be very glad if he stays, of course, it's hard for him to go, the prince said in reply to Lizaveta Prokofyevna's irritable questions. Are you asleep, or what? If you don't want to, dear boy, I'll have him transported to my place. Lord, he can barely stand up himself. Are you sick, or what? Earlier, not finding the prince on his deathbed, Lizaveta Prokofyevna had indeed greatly exaggerated the satisfactoriness of his state of health, judging it by appearances, but the recent illness, the painful memories that accompanied it, the fatigue of the eventful evening, the incident with Pavlishev's son, the present incident with Hippolyte, all this irritated the prince's morbid impressionability indeed almost to a feverish state. But, besides that, in his eyes there was now some other worry, even fear. He looked at Hippolyte warily, as if expecting something more from him. Suddenly Hippolyte stood up, terribly pale and with a look of dreadful, despairing shame on his distorted face. It was expressed mainly in the glance that he shot hatefully and timorously at the gathering, and in the lost, crooked, and creeping grin on his twitching lips. He lowered his eyes at once and trudged, swaying and still smiling in the same way, towards Burdovsky and Doktorenko, who stood by the terrace door. He was leaving with them. Well, that's what I was afraid of, exclaimed the prince. It had to be so. Hippolyte quickly turned to him with the most furious spite, and every little line of his face seemed to quiver and speak. Ah, you were afraid of that. It had to be so, in your opinion? Know, then, that if I hate anyone here, he screamed, wheezing, shrieking, spraying from his mouth, and I hate all of you, all of you. But you Jesuitical, treacly little soul, idiot, millionaire benefactor, I hate you more than anyone or anything in the world. I understood you and hated you long ago, when I'd only heard about you. I hated you with all the hatred of my soul. It was you who set it all up. It was you who drove me into a fit. You've driven a dying man to shame. You are to blame for my mean faint-heartedness. I'd kill you, if I stayed alive. I don't need your benefactions, I won't accept anything from anybody, do you hear? From anybody. I was delirious, and don't you dare to triumph. I curse you all now and forever. By then he was completely out of breath. Ashamed of his tears, Lebedev whispered to Lizaveta Prokofyevna. It had to be so. That's the prince for you. Read right through him. But Lizaveta Prokofyevna did not deign to look at him. She stood proud, erect, her head thrown back, and scrutinized these wretched little people with scornful curiosity. When Hippolyte finished, the general heaved his shoulders, she looked him up and down wrathfully, as if demanding an account of his movement, and at once turned to the prince. Thank you, Prince, eccentric friend of our house, for the pleasant evening you have provided for us all. Your heart must surely be glad of your success in hitching us to your foolery. Enough, dear friend of our house, thank you for at least allowing us finally to have a look at you. She indignantly began straightening her mantilla, waiting until they left. At that moment a hired droshky, which Doktorenko had sent Lebedev's son, a high school student, to fetch a quarter of an hour ago, drove up for them. Right after his wife, the general put in his own little word. Indeed, Prince, I never expected, after everything, after all our friendly connections, and, finally, Lizaveta Prokofyevna. But how can this be? Exclaimed Adelida, and she quickly went up to the prince and gave him her hand. The prince, looking like a lost man, smiled at her. Suddenly a hot, quick whisper seemed to scald his ear. If you don't drop these loathsome people at once, I'll hate you alone all my life, whispered Aglaya. She was as if in a frenzy, but she turned away before the prince had time to look at her. However, there was nothing and no one for him to drop. They had meanwhile managed to put the sick Hippolyte into the cab, and it drove off. Well, is this going to go on long, Ivan Fyodorovitch? What do you think? How long am I to suffer from these wicked boys? My dear, naturally, I'm prepared, and the prince, Ivan Fyodorovitch nevertheless held out his hand to the prince, but had no time for a handshake and rushed after Lizaveta Prokofyevna, who was noisily and wrathfully going down the steps from the terrace. Adelida, her fiancée, and Alexandra took leave of the prince sincerely and affectionately. Yevgeny Pavlovitch was also among them, and he alone was merry. It turned out as I thought. Only it's too bad that you, too, suffered, poor man, he whispered with the sweetest smile. Aglaya left without saying goodbye. But the adventures of that evening were not over yet. Lizaveta Prokofyevna was to endure one more quite unexpected meeting. Before she had time to go down the steps to the road, which skirted the park, a splendid equipage, a carriage drawn by 2 white horses, raced past the prince's dacha. Two magnificent ladies were sitting in the carriage. But before it had gone 10 paces past, the carriage stopped abruptly. One of the ladies quickly turned, as if she had suddenly seen some needed acquaintance. Yevgeny Pavlik. Is that you, dear? A ringing, beautiful voice suddenly cried, which made the prince, and perhaps someone else, give a start. Well, I'm so glad I've finally found you,